Hi there, my name's Rich. Sorry I can't be with you in person, but excited to share this material with you today. I hope you found it useful reflecting on those opening questions. When was the last time someone changed your mind about something? When was the last time you convinced someone to do something they weren't originally going to do? And the reason those questions are important is that we're talking about advocacy and campaigning, and that's what campaigning is. It's convincing people to do something they weren't originally going to do. So it's helpful to get into that frame of reference. Now, as I said, my name's Rich. I've spent the last 20 years working on advocacy and campaigning. I do this training for lots of different groups, Christian groups, also just activists, social justice campaigners around the world. I always use the same framework. Let's start with the definition of campaigning then. So what is it? It's influencing the actions of those in power to bring about justice. Influencing the actions of those in power to bring about justice. And if you want to do that effectively, there are 5 questions that you need to answer. And that's what we're going to go through today. 5 questions. Now, sometimes with campaigning, and particularly with all the noise on social media these days, it's hard to see the wood for the trees. And what these questions are going to do is bring you strategic clarity. Strategic clarity. Okay? They're going to help you understand the key things you have to know to effectively bring about change. Now, I've used this framework to influence some of the biggest companies in the world, Coca-Cola, Unilever, Pepsi. I've used them to influence the UK government. I've also used them at a really local level to influence Bradford Council Estates Department. You can use them with church leaders. They also apply outside of traditional campaigning. If you're doing more of a social justice project, setting up a community project, often you need to convince people, and so you can use the same framework there. We're going to look at lots of examples, including some that are very applicable, one from a Just Love group, for example. And what we're going to do is use the first 3 questions as a block, then take some time for an exercise. We'll pause this recording. You guys will have some time for an exercise, and then we'll take the final 2 questions and have another exercise after that. So here's the first question. It's very simple. What do you want? What do you want? Now, this needs to be specific. So it's not stop climate change. That's too general. It might be we want to put solar panels on the Students' Union roof. Okay? Let's give you a particular Just Love example. This was a group in Cambridge a few years ago, and they wanted to do something to support refugees. And they did some research, they prayed, and they realised that the university didn't have a scholarship scheme for refugees. So that became the specific ask. So the general sort of sense was we want to support refugees, but they came up with a really specific ask, which was establish a scholarship for refugees. It was hard work, they won. You can hear the story on the Hopeful Activist podcast. It's an episode called Campaign Successes. So that's the first question. What do you want? Needs to be specific. Second question, again, quite simple. Who can give it to you? Who can give it to you? Now, there might be more than one person here. So here we might use a tool called a power map. And here is one on the wall behind me. Now, I don't know if this writing might be backwards for you. Anyway, the top, it says power here. Maybe the video will flip round and it'll be the right way around. And this says support. Okay? So what we're doing on here is mapping out how powerful, how influential someone is in the process, and then how supportive they are of what you're asking for. Let's use a biblical example this time. So the book of Esther in the Old Testament, a guy called Mordecai hears about a plot to wipe out God's people. What does he want? First question, what does he want? Well, he doesn't want God's people to be wiped out. So he wants this kind of edict that's been issued to be annulled, for that to be changed. Who can give it to him? That's the second question. Well, Xerxes is the king. He's the emperor of Persia. He's ultimately the one that can give it to him. So we'll put him on the power map. He's the guy with all the power up here. We don't know where he sits exactly on support. So for the moment, maybe we'll just put him here. So that's Xerxes there. Okay. Now, who else does Mordecai know that has influence? Well, Esther, right? He knows Esther. He's related to Esther. Esther is the wife of Xerxes, but she's also Jewish, so presumably more supportive. So we don't know exactly where she'd sit, but maybe she's somewhere like here. Okay. And then we might also have, well, all of the other key decision makers. There'll be other people in Xerxes' court. There's the big bad guy in the story, Haman. So he's quite powerful, but he's probably here. Okay. And you can use this to map out all of the key people involved in the decision-making process. Now, often it helps if there is a specific policy process, a kind of decision-making process that we're trying to influence, and then we can put on here the key people that have a stake in that. And the aim is to increase the power of those that support us, so move people like Esther upwards, and it's to decrease the power of those who are against us, like this Haman guy, and then obviously it's to move unsupportive people towards supportive. And it just helps to have it mapped out often. Sometimes you'll think of people that you might not otherwise have thought of. So those are the first two questions. What do you want and who can give it to you? Very simple. You'll be doing a practical exercise on these in a minute, so you can start thinking about your own examples and where you might use this. Now, the third question is where it gets really interesting, okay? The third question is, why haven't they done it already? So you've got this great idea, you know who can give it to you. Why haven't they done it already if it's such a good idea? Okay. Now, some people have a real knack for understanding what will be influential here. And the thing with this question, why haven't they given it to you already, is that the answer to this starts to take us towards specific tactics that will be influential for us. So my kids, Aidan and Nathaniel, they're two people who are quite aware of what it will be influential for them. They're already looking like quite good negotiators and advocates. And one specific example of this, we went on a walk a few years ago with some friends, and we walked past an ice cream van. So all the kids, not just ours, but the other kids obviously want an ice cream. The grown-ups were all talking. The kids are like, we want an ice cream. Oh no, we're talking blah, blah, blah. So they're thinking, well, what can we do? 30 seconds later, all the kids are chanting, what do we want? Ice cream. When do we want it? Now. What do we want? Ice cream. When do we want it? Now. And creating a little bit of a scene around the ice cream van, getting the attention of everyone else there, and they get their ice cream. So I guess what they intuitively understood is that we were busy, we were talking, ice cream wasn't really a priority for us. People weren't necessarily against it, but what they needed to do was move this up the priority ladder for the adults. And they'd obviously been paying attention on the climate marches, so they knew the chant, and there we go. Okay, now that problem, lack of prioritisation, is really common. It's the main issue in some advocacy work I'm involved in Indonesia at the moment about workers' rights, where it's not as if the government is opposed to the idea. They've just got loads of things on their plate and it isn't top of the priority list. And that's common in lots of advocacy situations. But that's not the only option. There's quite a few different options here. So let's explore a few of them. So you've got the decision maker. Your decision maker hasn't implemented your idea yet. They haven't given you the ice cream. Why is that? Well, we've talked about lack of prioritization. Another example might be very simply, they don't know about the problem, or they don't know about your solution. So in the refugee scholarship example, perhaps they just haven't considered the possibility of there being a refugee scholarship before, and it's simply about highlighting the problem and providing an idea. That's the easiest problem to fix. Unfortunately, it's the least common barrier in my experience. Another option might be that they disagree with you about the solution. So they know there's a problem, but they don't think your solution is the right one. Or perhaps the opposing side is more powerful. Perhaps you're working on climate change. Fossil fuel companies will lose if you succeed. So you're going up against some really big vested interests. Now I'm going to use an example to consider some of these different reasons. I used to live in inner city Bradford, and when I was there was a rundown park at the end of the street, and we wanted to turn it into a place that was, less about drug dealing and more about kids walking to the swings and people sitting in the sun and families hanging out and having a good time. Now, on the edge of the park, there was a rundown building that was the old Park Lodge. And at the moment, it was being used for storage and for a bit of desk space for some council workers. But we thought, if we had that, we could turn that into a really good community space. We could put a little community cafe in the bottom. We could have some youth work operating alongside it. And that would help to revitalise the park. So we did some research and we were aware of this process called community asset transfer, where community groups could be given buildings like that by the council on what's called a peppercorn lease. So you get it for 50 years or 100 years and you pay £10 a year in rent. So you're effectively getting the building for free. So we said, well, we could do that and we could turn that building into this amazing community space. So we approached the estates department at the council and said, look, this is what we'd like to do. Could you give us this on a community asset transfer? And they said, look, we just don't think your cafe will earn any money. We don't think it will break even. So if we give you the building, you'll be out of business in a few years and then we'll have a big headache. So what's the problem here? The problem is they disagree with us about the solution, right? So what tactic should we use? Well, we could mobilise lots of people in the community to, write letters or march, but if fundamentally they disagree and they think it's just not economically viable, that's not necessarily going to convince them. They're going to say, well, look, we know it's important to the community, but if it goes bust, it doesn't matter. So instead, we do the economic analysis. We do a business case, we do market research, we write a long document spelling out all the financials with forecasts and everything, saying here's how it will break even. And that convinces them, okay? So at that point, they say to us, you can have the building, but you will need to raise the money for the renovations. And it's in quite a dilapidated state, so it needs, 300 plus grand to turn it around, so a lot of money. So they say, if you raise the money, we will give you the building on a community asset transfer. Big win. We go away, spend some time, we managed to raise all that money, mix of grants and loans. Okay, so fast forward all the hard work involved in that, and it was a lot of hard work. So now we come back to them and say, we've raised the money, we need the lease. And the funders have said, you need to get the lease document before we release the funding. Now, we're there, the estates department say, that's fine, go to the lawyers, the legal department, they'll issue the lease. The lawyers just aren't responding to us. They're not responding to emails, they're not picking up the phone. And meanwhile, the weeks are ticking by and we're starting to get towards the deadline when our funders have said we need to provide the lease. And we just can't get through. Now, what's the problem here? The problem is the legal department at the council are really busy. They've got loads of paperwork to do, quite a lot of community asset transfers going through, and ours just isn't a priority. This is the classic, it's not a priority for the people who can make this decision. So what do we do now? Well, it's a different tactic, right? We don't need economic analysis now. What we do is we find out that our local councillor is the deputy council leader, and he does surgeries, meetings where anyone can come and meet with him in our area fairly regularly. Normally, 3 or 4 people turn up to these things. So we mobilise a lot of local people. There's a group called the Friends of Bowling Park. We all turn up in the orange hoodies at this surgery. So rather than there being 4 people, there's loads of people really annoyed about this. So he is on his BlackBerry in the meeting, messaging, and I get a call on Monday morning saying this became a political issue over the weekend. What do you need? We'll get the documents to you now. Okay, so different tactic, different problem, different tactic, mobilising people in that case, and that's successful. And that cafe was up and running, so that project worked. Now we actually encountered one other hurdle in that project, and that was powerful vested interests. And this is because those people already in the lodge that were using it for storage space, for a bit of office space, they were the council parks department. They didn't want to give it up. So they didn't want us to have the building because they wanted to use it. And obviously, because they're inside the council, they were quite influential. And often when you're coming up against vested interests, there are two tactics that you can use. I mean, more than two, but two useful ones to consider are mobilising other powerful constituencies and transparency, shining a light on what's going on, the way that vested interests are maybe pulling the strings, not in the in a sort of slightly shadowy way. So for us, mobilising other powerful interests is what we did. We realised that within the council there were other people who were really important, more influential than the Parks Department, and that was the people working on local community work, on sort of particular regions, obviously the Estates Department, the councillors themselves, and mobilising them outweighed the opposing voice of the Parks Department using the lodge. One other cool example about that is I knew some guys who were working on trying to stop an open cast coal mine being built in a really beautiful area of Northumberland up in the northeast near the coast. And obviously they were going up against some big vested interests there that wanted this coal mine built so they could make profits. And they were struggling a bit, coming up against such powerful interests. And one of them who was involved found an old fax number for David Attenborough. So an old fax number. I mean, who uses a fax nowadays, right? But he thought, let's just give it a try. We'll send David Attenborough a fax. Believe it or not, David Attenborough still had a fax machine in his office. And so the fax came through directly to David Attenborough, not via anyone else. And he agreed to support the campaign. So they were able to mobilise another powerful figure to support them. And that story is also on that Hopeful Activist podcast episode, Campaign Successes. Okay, so what we're going to do now is move into a practical exercise where you can think about each of those three questions. So what do you want? Who can give it to you? You've got the power map you can use. And why haven't they done it already? And with why haven't they done it already, start thinking about the reasons there and what different tactics would be appropriate given those reasons. So what I want you to do is think about an example of something you might want to campaign on. Maybe you're already working on something, just starting to think about it. And I want you to take it and work through those three questions in groups. Okay, I hope you had a good discussion. And you've probably started to touch on some issues we're going to think about now in questions 4 and 5. Question 4. What do they care about? So you've identified what you want, who can give it to you, why they haven't done it already. Fourth question, what do they care about? Now there's a few things that might be on the list here. For most institutions, reputation is right up there. So media is something to think about. Okay, now with media, I wouldn't suggest, straight out of the gate you go to the papers and run a super embarrassing story about whoever you're targeting. I'd probably want to build some bridges first. Understand what the obstacles are, understand question 3. But the media is often very influential, and local media is actually surprisingly easy to get. When I was working on that campaign in Bradford, it's really a case of emailing or calling up local journalists. They're always looking for stories. Local radio as well, they'll often come down and do an interview with you. And if you get media like that, the thing to do is then to send it around, put it on social media. If you're in touch with decision makers, send it to them and say, oh, look, we got this story in the local paper, thought you'd be interested to see it. Because they're probably not going to find it themselves. But if you send it to them or make people aware, if you amplify it, it can have a big impact. And you've obviously got potentially student media as well if you're working on a university campaign. So that's reputation. Another is legacies. This is a bit related. For decision makers about to retire, often they just want to do something great, towards the end of their career, be remembered for something good that they did. Um, you might even find someone that cares about what you care about. Someone that's passionate about refugee rights, passionate about social justice. You might find an ally like that in the organisation you're targeting. Now, there's some really interesting examples of this. Don't know if anyone's heard of the Craftivists. There's a book called The Art of Gentle Protest by Sarah Corbett, and they use funny tactics like knitting little things to send to people. They did a campaign with M&S for a fair wage, for the living wage, and they sent little knitted things to all the key decision makers in M&S when they were targeting them. I've seen, mugs made for decision makers where, it's the decision maker's head imposed on Superman, put on a mug, sort of playing to their ego and just a bit funny. There's lots of funny things you can do like that. In the story of Esther we considered earlier, she uses quite an interesting tactic. So the first thing she does when she wants to ask Xerxes about this is not to go and say, look, can you stop the genocide against the Jews? She invites him to a banquet, and then does this whole banquet. At the end of it, makes another request, come to another banquet, and so on until eventually she does present the issue she cares about. So we don't know exactly why she does that, but maybe Xerxes really cared about food. He liked banquets. He liked the hospitality thing. Who knows? It's just an interesting tactic, right? Maybe it came from considering, what is Xerxes into? What does he like? So that's the fourth question. What do they care about? And there's a good exercise you can do here called the 3 chairs exercise. And I would actually do this with 3 chairs in real life, 3 chairs. And what happens is you sit in the first chair and you take the role of yourselves, the activists, the advocates, saying, this is what I care about, this is our asks, and try and convince the decision maker. Then someone else sits in the second chair and they respond as the decision maker that you're targeting, explaining their perspective, what their view is. And then someone sits in the third chair and they point out areas of connection between the two, possible avenues you could explore to move things forward together. It's an exercise often used in peace building contexts, and it's a useful one for trying to get into the shoes of the people that you're trying to target and understand what matters to them. Right, question 5, last question. This is, what do you have in your hand? And the reason this is important is that sometimes we can do this analysis, answer the other questions, and these problems can just feel so big. It's so difficult for us to have any traction to actually influence things. And this 5th question, what do you have in your hand, helps us to bridge what we can bring, what we can do with the reality of the situation. What's our unique contribution here? What's our piece of the puzzle? And it could be lots of different things. It could be relationships, time, expertise. As students, you've got people power and the ability to mobilize. Other people are often insanely busy. When you get to, my age, you've got 2 kids, you're working. But sometimes as students, you have the time and the sort of relational networks that other people don't have. And there are other things, I have particular expertise as well. Often there's a tool here you can use called a network analysis. There's a good example in this book, which I'll say more about at the end, from one of my old TF1 colleagues, Jack. And that describes a campaign with young people around climate change, where they were trying to influence the Prime Minister. It was Boris Johnson at that point. The G7 was going to be in the UK. And they were working with these young people thinking, how on earth can we connect young people with a way of influencing the Prime Minister on this stuff? They did the network analysis to understand their connections and the connections they had. And they realised out of doing that analysis that these young people had a local MP who was a Christian and was also quite close to Boris Johnson. He was passionate about working with young people. So they had an in there and they were able to use that. They also had some connections where the G7 was going to be hosted. And so despite the apparent disconnect between these 17 and 18-year-olds and Boris Johnson, they actually found a way. They mapped out where they lived, their local MP, their local sort of connections, and then looked at decision makers' connections, the power analysis, and they actually found a way of connecting the two. Okay, so you can look that up. So that's the 5 questions. That last one, what do you have in your hand? There's a couple of other things I want to say though, beyond those 5 questions. And the first is about prayer. Because what I would say is that prayer, listening to God, is actually more important than all of those 5 questions. When you're deciding what to work on, when you're doing your, research is important for that, but prayer and listening to God is maybe even more important. When you're thinking about your tactics, question 3 is really important, but also be prayerful about it. And sometimes what we find with prayer is it can sort of short circuit things. We just get an idea drops into our minds, which proves to be the winning tactic. And also sometimes when it looks like things have fallen apart, prayer gives us the hope, the courage to carry on. I mean, I've worked on some things where, including that project with Bowling Park Lodge and some other things internationally, where it's looked like it's game over. We're not going to succeed. But when I've prayed about it, I've just felt, God is still in this. This, despite how it looks, this is maybe going to happen. And we've stuck at it, and then boom, it's opened up again and it has happened. So I'd say prayer is absolutely key. Saturate your process in prayer and listening to God. That's really important. And then the final thing is in the form of a quote from Sarah Corbett, who I mentioned earlier. If we want the world to be beautiful, kind, and just, then our activism must be beautiful, kind, and just. Right? If we want the world to be beautiful, kind, and just, our activism must be beautiful, kind, and just. So when we're doing campaigning, it can be quite easy to dehumanise the people we're campaigning against. And there are people out there doing terrible things. We absolutely have to speak truth to power and to do that forcefully. But we also want our activism to hold out the possibility of restored relationship. That requires speaking truth to power, but it also requires us just to step back, if we can, from demonising the people we're targeting and from seeing things in a really kind of them and us type way. So just be careful about that when you're doing your campaigning. Further information, I mentioned this book. The talk I've given is basically in this book, The Hopeful Activist, with more information. There's loads of other really good stuff in there about how to avoid burnout, about how to work out what to do with your life, how to work out what God has put at your core, the unique reflection you carry of the image of God, how to handle power, all sorts of things in here. So this came out a couple of years ago. I wrote it with a friend called Rachel Walker, and it was based on a lot of research we did and also podcast interviews that we did with another friend called Abby for the Hopeful Activist podcast. And those are all still online. I think they're in the Just Love resources. But there's 200 plus interviews on there with activists doing all sorts of things. It can give you lots and lots of ideas. So those are good places to go for further information. I hope that's been helpful. If you've got time now, I'd recommend having a bit more exercise time and either carrying on in the groups you were before, thinking about those 3 questions, or thinking about doing the 3 chairs exercise that I just described, or start thinking about what you have in your hand. So what's the particular piece of the puzzle you can bring, mapping out your relational networks and how that connects. So it's been a pleasure to do this for you. Thanks for having me virtually.